Hey everybody, Samuel Allred here. Welcome back to the Persistence Outdoors podcast. If you've got any hunts planned this fall that are any longer than a day, you're likely going to need a stove. Don't get me wrong, cooking over an open fire is a great way to prepare a meal. But it takes a long time, it's messy, and in some places, it's even illegal. Whether you're backpack hunting for a few days, setting up base camp for a few weeks, or you just want a hot drink on a cold day hunt, a stove is the way to go. So that's what we're going to talk about today. 4 different types of stoves that you might use hunting, what they're best for, pros and cons, and a few examples of each type. And really, this podcast is geared towards helping you choose the right kind of stove for your hunt. Before we start, please take a moment to support this podcast by sending an episode to a friend, rating it 5 stars, hitting the notification button. All of these things will help the podcast grow and help more people get outside and into hunting, which is what Persistence Outdoors is all about. So thank you for supporting the show, and let's get into it. As I was thinking about camp stoves, a few different memories came to mind, and I thought I'd share these just for fun. And if you're not familiar with camp stoves, this may help you start to understand some of the limitations we're dealing with. So I grew up in Boy Scouts from ages 11 to 17. I was pretty heavily involved in Boy Scouts, and Boy Scouts was great because we had to plan trips essentially just as youth, and we had to think through all the logistics. And while we were supported by the adults, a lot of the planning actually fell to us. And so before every trip, we would get together with our patrol, and that would be, maybe up to 8 scouts, and a number of you would be going on the trip. So maybe 3 to 5 of you were going on the trip, and you would get together and plan a menu for your trip. So you would have to think about how many days you were going to be out, and then how many meals you had, and then how you were going to cook the meals and who was going to go out and buy the food and delegate all those responsibilities. And as I've talked about before on the podcast, some foods are easier to cook in the backcountry than others. A good choice is oatmeal, because all you have to do to cook oatmeal is boil water. Or maybe you would use a freeze-dried meal. I actually went pretty in-depth on this in episode 37 called Backpacking Food, Planning a Menu. So some foods are easier than others, and generally you're going for convenient foods because your camp stoves often aren't that capable. Despite this, we often didn't make smart decisions, and every once in a while, a patrol would come up with a bright idea to bring steak. And steak was kind of the pinnacle of camping food. It was kind of a big flex, right? It meant that you were living large while everybody else was eating oatmeal and peanut butter. So I remember on one particular outing, we were staying in cabins and we were snowshoeing or cross-country skiing nearby, and it was frigid outside. And we didn't have a place to cook inside the cabins. You could only cook outside, and it was maybe around 15 degrees. And on this trip, a patrol had decided to bring steak. So the designated chef was taking the steak out of the packaging in the cabin, and it was all red and bloody. And he goes out and presumably is cooking the steak. He's gone for easily 25 minutes. He's freezing his butt off, finally comes back inside, and the steak looks pretty much the same. He was trying to cook it on a backpacking stove with a thin, small pan, and just couldn't get enough heat and pressure in the canister he was using, and was really unable to sear the steak effectively at all. So he comes inside and says something like, "Well, I like my steak rare anyway." And it definitely wasn't rare. It was just raw. So nobody was really happy with that, but A+ for effort, I suppose. Other times we would try to bring bacon, and again, seemed like a great idea. Of course, you would eat bacon and eggs for breakfast and have a gourmet meal. And we would bring like a pound of bacon. And then on the morning, we're cooking our food and we realize we only have room in our little pan or in our pot, if we didn't bring a pan, to cook about one strip of bacon at a time. And to get it to actually cook, you had to cut it into 3 pieces and then put it on the bottom of your pan and wait and then flip it. So you're doing about 1 piece of bacon every 8 minutes or so, if that. And it was just a slow, painstaking process, and people would start to just lose interest and not even eat breakfast. Or another time, we had cooked some bacon and we also wanted to cook eggs. And whoever was cooking decided that they would just use the bacon grease to cook the eggs. And there was actually a decent amount of bacon grease. But they took the eggs, which were cracked into a Nalgene water bottle and pre-scrambled that way. And the guy who was cooking just poured the eggs straight into the bacon grease and was expecting them to scramble. But since the stove was so anemic and it was also cold outside, the eggs just kind of sat and mixed with the bacon grease. And it took them about 15 or 20 minutes to actually get them to start to solidify. And it just looked horrible. It did not look appetizing at all. And I think he ended up eating those, but I don't think I would touch them. So I just have many memories of sort of backcountry cooking gone wrong, or even not backcountry, just camping cooking gone wrong because we didn't have the right kind of equipment, or we just overestimated the power of our little canister stoves. There's lots of different types of camp stoves out there, but I think for hunters, the useful stoves fall into 4 main categories. And these are portable propane camp stoves, Jetboil style stove systems that have an integrated pot and burner, liquid fuel stoves, and canister fuel stoves. And there's certainly a lot of overlap between these types of stoves, and there's other types of stoves that you could use, like alcohol burning stoves or even wood burning stoves. But these are the main categories I want to talk about today. So we'll start with portable propane camp stoves. These are like your Coleman 2-burner stoves, super popular, or something a little bit more robust, like a Camp Chef Explorer, which has 2 burners but actually hooks up to a big white propane tank. These stoves are great for car camping and anytime you have a long-term base camp. So if you're going to an area you want to hunt and you're setting up a wall tent and you're going to be there for 2 weeks, it's nice to have a stove like this because you'll just have a lot of flexibility with it. You have a lot of firepower, essentially, a lot of heat, and it's just going to make cooking camp meals so much easier than trying to use one of the other options. Now, they're not great anytime you need to bring them somewhere because even the Coleman 2-burner, which is pretty foldable and compact, isn't going to be a good option if you're trying to backpack somewhere, for example. So usually they're helpful if you have a vehicle to transport them, or maybe even horses, or you might be staying in one place for a long time. With a portable propane camp stove, you can use pretty much any type of pan you want. You could use cast iron if you wanted to. You could use stainless steel. You might avoid some of the thinner pots and pans that are marketed for backpacking because they're just not going to cook as evenly and they may lead to burning your food. But for the most part, you can put whatever you want on there and likely the stove is going to have enough power to heat and cook your food. So we've covered some of them, but let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages compared to the other types of stove. So some of the advantages are that they have multiple burners. If you need to cook with multiple pots or you have a big pan, they will all fit on there in a way that they wouldn't on your other stove options. You have plenty of heat and you can likely simmer. A lot of stoves just have one heat setting and it works great for boiling water, but if you actually want to cook something that needs to simmer for a while, you're out of luck. Portable propane camp stoves are also great because it's easy to find fuel. You can find these types of stoves at Walmart, and if you have the right hose attachment, you can use either the little green propane tanks or the big white propane tanks. And then finally, these stoves work well even in very cold temperatures. Some stoves have issues where the fuel loses pressure in the canister in cold temperatures, but propane stoves don't tend to have that problem. Now, some disadvantages, the main disadvantage is that they're heavy. You're generally not going to be bringing these anywhere on foot. Now, I have seen people bring these on snow hikes in a sled. So a Coleman 2-burner for a whole group of people, and they pulled it on a sled. But for hunting purposes, there's just not many scenarios where you're going to pack in an entire propane camp stove. Let's talk about Jetboil style stove systems. If you haven't seen one before, these stoves have an integrated burner, windscreen, and pot. So you have the burner portion, which you can turn on and light. And then you have a pot that on the bottom of the pot has a little piece that screws on to the burner. And when you screw it onto the burner, it creates a windscreen around the burner, and then it directly transfers heat from the burner to the pot. The pot sometimes functions like a mug as well. So it may have a cozy on it, may have a little handle, and they are highly efficient when it comes to fuel consumption and energy transfer. And it leads to very fast boiling times. Hence the name Jetboil. Jetboil is a brand. I think they were one of the first companies to introduce this style of stove system large scale. Jetboil isn't the only one to make these anymore, and different companies have come up with their own versions that are used for different purposes. Another good example is an MSR reactor. MSR is the brand and reactor is the model, and it's made in a similar way, although it's designed more like a pot and less like a mug. These stoves are designed for one thing and one thing only: boiling water and doing it fast. And often that's all you need when you're backpack hunting or backpacking. You are going to choose food and meals that can be cooked with boiling water only. You might be eating a lot of freeze-dried meals, or you even make meals in your pot that just have to be boiled. Another time you might want a stove like this is when you need to melt a lot of snow. Maybe you're on a spring bear hunt and you're going to be up high, glassing, and you're going to rely on snow as a water source. Bringing one of these super efficient water boiling stove systems could make your life a lot easier. When it comes to cookware with these stove systems, you're really limited to the integrated pots, and there's not a whole lot of variety. Now, you can get a pot support adapter, and this will make your Jetboil style stove function like just a normal canister stove, essentially. But when you do that, you're losing a lot of the efficiency that you get from using an integrated pot. And at that point, you might as well save some money and get a cheaper stove. So let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages. Like we've talked about, they are very efficient. You're going to use less fuel than other stoves to boil the same amount of water. And they're also very fast at boiling water, some of the fastest. Now, there are lots of disadvantages. The first is bulk and weight. These stoves are not the smallest that they can be because of all the different components and the way that they integrate. They're usually pretty long, they're kind of bulky, and they're not the lightest stoves out there. Because they are often long or tall, they can be a little bit unstable if you don't have the correct supports, or if you put your stove somewhere just a little bit uneven. Often they can cost a lot of money. Your average Jetboil goes for around $100 and change, and an MSR reactor goes for over $200, which is very expensive compared to other canister stoves. They will need additional parts if you want to use anything other than the integrated pot. Many of them can't regulate temperature, so they can't simmer and allow you to cook anything other than boiling water. And finally, because these are canister stoves, sometimes you will run into canister fuel issues, meaning that in very cold temperatures, your canister can start to lose pressure and your stove won't perform as well, or the canister will start to run low on fuel and your stove will start to lose output. So these stoves are very specialized and they do what they're meant to do very, very well, but they're not very versatile, and compared to other stoves, they have a lot of drawbacks. Now, in contrast to Jetboil style stoves, liquid fuel stoves are some of the most versatile stoves out there, but not everybody is going to need a liquid fuel stove. So liquid fuel stoves can burn white gas, kerosene, unleaded gasoline. There may be other fuel types, and many times you can burn all of these different types of fuels in the same stove. Not at the same time, but you can just fill your liquid fuel container with any of these types of fuels and cook successfully. Now, liquid fuel stoves are a little bit more complicated than stoves that use only canister fuel. They often have more parts. You have to pump your fuel container to pressurize the fuel, and then you have to prime the stove. So you actually have to heat the burner of the stove before you can light it, because the liquid that is pumped into the stove is a liquid, right? It's not a gas. And so heating the burner allows the liquid to transform into a gas, and then you can light it and use it like a gas stove. But you have to prime the stove by allowing a little bit of that liquid to drip into a pan below the burner, and then you light that liquid in the pan, it heats the burner, and then you go from there. So it's a little bit more complicated, and it takes a few minutes to actually get your stove up and running. One of the most popular examples of a liquid fuel stove is the MSR WhisperLite, and they even have a model which is the WhisperLite Universal, and this can not only burn white gas, kerosene, unleaded gasoline, you can also get an attachment to use a canister with it. So it can burn all sorts of different fuels, and pretty much no matter where you are in the world, you can likely find something that stove can run on. So it's super, super versatile, and the MSR WhisperLite is one of the best-selling liquid fuel stoves of all time. Another good example of a liquid fuel stove, if you want a different option, is the Primus OmniFuel. And there's others out there, but those are two of the most popular. Pots and pans for these stoves are usually made out of lightweight, thin metal. You want it to be light because if you're using this sort of stove, chances are that you're hunting or camping out of a backpack, and you usually want it to be thin to allow heat to transfer as easily as possible. So you have a couple different options. Lots of people like titanium. Titanium is super lightweight. It is incredibly durable, and you can make very thin pots and pans that weigh almost nothing at all. And they're great for when you're backpacking and you already have a lot of other gear that's adding to the overall weight of your pack. Now, titanium can also be very expensive, and the thin metal, this is kind of a problem with all the materials, but the thin metal can lead to burning because the heat goes right through it and it doesn't distribute the heat very well. And so you can end up burning your food. Titanium pots are really best for boiling. You can also find aluminum cookware, and aluminum is great because it's fairly light. It may scratch easier than titanium, but it's probably not going to be unusable, and it's much more inexpensive than titanium. You'll also find stainless steel. Stainless steel is pretty indestructible, and so that's really nice. It's going to be heavier than your titanium and aluminum options, but where it really shines is doing any sort of cooking besides boiling. Stainless steel retains heat and heats a little bit more evenly than titanium and aluminum. So if you want to do any camp cooking that requires simmering or maybe frying, stainless steel might be the way to go. Something you definitely want to avoid is cast iron. If you go to the sporting goods aisle of a big store like Walmart, you'll see cast iron pots and pans all over the place. And cast iron is great for cooking over a fire or for cooking on a more robust 2-burner propane stove. But for these smaller stoves, your canister and liquid fuel stoves, cast iron is just going to take forever to heat up, and it's really not a great option. Not to mention, it's super heavy and you're not going to want to carry it in your backpack anyway. So you have a couple different options. They're going to be similar unless you're using stainless steel, something a little bit more substantial. One thing that I would watch out for is nonstick coatings. Everybody knows that nonstick coatings are really bad for you now. And so if you want to protect your health and not get PFAS and other things in your food, I would just get something that doesn't have a nonstick coating. A little bit of a detour there, but let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of liquid fuel stoves. One of the main things that people use liquid fuel stoves for is camping in very cold weather. Because you're using that liquid fuel that you can manually pressurize, you can adjust to how cold the temperatures are, and you can always have the pressure you need to cook. Whereas a canister stove can get really cold and start to lose pressure, with a liquid fuel stove, you don't have to worry about that. So if you're ever hunting in very, very cold conditions, the liquid fuel stove might be for you. You can also use multiple different types of fuel, like we talked about, which would be really nice if you were traveling. And another nice thing about liquid fuel stoves is that you only have to bring the amount of fuel that you need. With canister stoves, you kind of have to estimate how much you're going to use. You give it a little shake, see how much is sloshing around in there. And then if you think you're going to use more than you have left, you have to grab a whole new canister. But with a liquid fuel stove, you can be pretty careful about bringing only what you need. Now, some of the disadvantages are that liquid fuel stoves are heavier than canister stoves. Because they're a little bit more complicated and have more parts, they're going to weigh more. You have to prime them, and that takes some time. And sometimes it can be tricky to prime the stove. I remember borrowing a liquid fuel stove from a friend when I was backpacking with my family, and we go to light it, and not so far into the process of priming the stove, there is just a huge fireball coming out from the stove. And whoever was trying to prime it steps back and lets it burn down. And so we go back to look at the instructions again, and it says in the instructions, expect a soccer ball sized flame. So that's kind of what you're dealing with, just a giant flame for a minute, and then it dies down, and then you actually light the stove. So priming can be a pain. It's something you get used to, and it's not that hard once you've done it a couple times, but you do have to do it. Another disadvantage of liquid fuel stoves is the maintenance involved. You have to refill the fuel. Depending on your fuel source, the stove may not burn as cleanly, so you may have to clean it, and it's just a little bit more involved than a canister stove. And finally, these stoves, since they're a little bit more complicated, can also be more expensive than your run-of-the-mill canister fuel stove. So they're super versatile, and if you particularly need that capability in cold weather, a liquid fuel stove is the way to go. All right, the last kind of stove I want to talk about is the canister fuel stove. Now, technically, Jetboil stoves are canister fuel stoves, but that type of stove system has a few of its own characteristics, so I wanted to talk about those separately. But canister fuel stoves are very versatile and some of the most common stoves that you're going to encounter. A canister fuel stove is essentially just a little gas burner that screws onto a fuel canister. And it is really simple. It usually has an integrated pot support so that you can set a pot on the stove. It rests on that pot support, and then just below it is this gas burner. And all you have to do is turn up the gas, light it, and you're good to go. Some of these stoves even have a piezo igniter, which is a little sparker that you press the button, it lights it, and you don't even have to have a lighter. Some really popular examples of canister fuel stoves are the MSR Pocket Rocket and the Soto Windmaster. But there's a number of cheap alternatives that you can even find on Amazon for less money. They're not name brands, but they're just made in China or something, and they work pretty much the same. And most of them have similar features. Canister fuel stoves use the same types of pots and pans that liquid fuel stoves use. Basically, you're just looking for something that is lightweight and thin. So we don't have to go over those. Let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of a canister stove. Canister stoves are simple and easy to use. Unlike liquid fuel stoves, you don't have to do anything to prime them. You literally just turn up the gas and light them, and you're ready to start cooking. Usually they have fewer parts than a liquid fuel stove, and you can use any sort of pot or pan you want with them, unlike the Jetboil style stove systems. Another nice thing about canister stoves is that they tend to be very affordable. Almost all of them are going to come in under $100, and some even under $50. And you can get an MSR Pocket Rocket for around $60 to $75, depending on the model and where you buy it from. But you can also go on Amazon and find very similar stoves for a lot less money, even $20. And they're likely going to work in a very similar way. So it's great that they're so affordable. Anybody can access one of these types of stoves, whereas a Jetboil at over $100 or a liquid fuel stove, also maybe over $100, might start to price some people out. These stoves tend to be very lightweight because they're simple, because they're just a burner with pot supports. They are very lightweight and they can be very small. And this is a huge advantage when you're backpack hunting and trying to save weight and save space in your pack. Another nice thing about these stoves is that many of them can simmer. You just turn up the gas or turn it down, and you can actually have some control over your cooking. Now, on the flip side, these stoves have some of the same drawbacks that your Jetboil style stove systems do. So, first of all, they can be unstable. When you stack a stove on top of a little fuel canister and then put a pot on that, and maybe it's a tall pot, and then you pour some water into it, well, now you have a very top-heavy little system. And if you don't have the right supports or you're on uneven ground, that can lead to you spilling scalding hot water all over the place, and that's just a bad deal. These stoves can also be susceptible to wind. Different stoves are designed differently, and some have a little metal piece that protects the burner from wind, but the lightweight models and the inexpensive models generally aren't as robust and may not do as well in wind. You also have the whole issue of canister performance at cold temperatures, like we've talked about, or when the canister is low on gas. And again, it's hard to estimate how much fuel you have left short of actually weighing the canister. So they have some drawbacks. In very cold temperatures, they're not going to work as well as a liquid fuel stove. They're not quite as robust or efficient as a Jetboil style stove system. But for 3 seasons and for 80% of your backpack hunts, this is likely the type of stove that you're going to reach for. So those are the 4 different types of stoves that I think are particularly useful for hunters. You have your big, heavy 2-burner stoves that you're going to use for base camp and car camping. And then you have a number of different options, and you can just choose one based on the type of environment you're going to be in and what's important to you. Do you want the fastest boiling stove and don't mind a little extra weight and bulk? Or are you looking for something that is super streamlined and small and will take up the least amount of space in your pack? Or are you going to be in winter conditions and you really need that liquid fuel stove for the performance aspect of it? Before I wrap this up, there are a few features that you might look for on each stove that could be on any of these types of stoves. So I mentioned a couple of these stoves can be unstable. You can look for stoves that have a more stable base, generally meaning they're going to have a wider pot support, or you can find little supports to put on the bottom of your canister, and it makes a tripod that is maybe 8 inches across instead of just the 3.5 or 4 of your canister. And that will give you a lot more stability and make cooking safer and prevent spilling your food all over the place. I also mentioned a piezo igniter. These are little push button igniters. These can be really nice because you don't have to go and fish around for your lighter. Now, you do want to be careful because piezo igniters can fail, so you do want to have a backup regardless. Another good feature to look for is some sort of windscreen, whether that's a separate windscreen or an integrated one. Many liquid fuel stoves will come with a little piece of aluminum that you can set up around the stove and it blocks some wind. Other stoves will be built with an integrated windscreen, and it can be just a little cup around the burner. Or on a Jetboil style stove, it's the whole sleeve around the perimeter of the burner. But it's helpful to have some sort of wind protection because if you get into a very windy situation, it's going to be harder to light the stove, and also it's going to reduce the efficiency of the stove. And then finally, if it's important to you, you might want to look at where the stove is made. I know that many MSR products are made in the US, and while they can be a little bit more pricey sometimes, they definitely make good, durable products. And so if that's important to you, definitely check them out. All right, guys. Well, I hope this has been helpful for you. And with this information, hopefully you have a good idea of what kind of stove you'll need. If you're new to cooking with a camp stove, it's not a bad idea to break it out before the season and try and cook with it. It will help you understand the limitations and be more comfortable when you're trying to cook with cold fingers after the sun goes down. So take some time this summer to test it out and get familiar with it. With that, I think I'll wrap this up. Thank you all for supporting the podcast, and I will catch you next week.